I want to start out by just recognizing and having all of us who didn't get a chance to acknowledge it. One of the reasons why the eloquent presentation we just heard points towards a leader that was consistently powerful during the 60s and middle 70s at San Francisco State. Dr. Garrett, we knew him as Jimmy Garrett in those days, just really brought things together. He was an incredibly powerful figure. And his pick and shovel work in terms of the history of the EC starting up is accurate as far as I'm concerned. Okay, let me do a little bio before I go into 67, 68, and 69. I was brought on campus because Ian Grand, who inherited the leadership of the experimental college from that cadre that Dr. Garrett talked about, went to a conference in Davis with the Panthers and others about experimental education, and I gave a speech. I was studying at the time with Herbert Marcuse, a name that was mentioned by Dr. Garrett. I was an anarcho-communist, hardcore organizer, and he brought me onto campus because he was afraid that the experimental college didn't have enough political activism in it. And so that observation, again, by Dr. Garrett is accurate. I went ahead and worked there, and then I worked after the experimental college with Los Siete, which is a Latino power in the mission. And then Benny Stewart and Jerry Bernardo had me work in North of Market in the Tenderloin with Runaways. And then I worked with the Nicaraguans during their revolution. Then I worked with Manning Marable and Moses Kenyatta on the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 80s, and worked in Grenada after the US invasion with the young people there, putting together a program, a socialist program, to try to help them out. And then in the 90s and the early part of this century, I worked with the experimental college, not experimental college, East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, which is the first Buddhist center in the United States run by BIPOC people and LGBTQ people. So I've seen a lot of different permutations of leadership, and I've always worked in organizations where people of color were in charge, because that's what white people should do. That's just what we should do. All right. When Ian brought me in 67, Dr. Garrett was right. Things were changing. The courses went up to as many as 100 courses with 10,000 people on campus. The courses included, and the course that was always made fun of was the Indigenous Peoples Basket Weaving course. It wasn't made fun of by Indigenous people, but it was made fun of at the leadership level in terms of the trustees. There was a guerrilla warfare course given by Roberto Kofke, which became famous and hit the newspapers. Turned out later Roberto Kofke was an agent of the CIA. We had courses on, I think, almost every major political and religious movement going. I mean, the Trots on campus had their own courses. There, Sam Burkholz, who founded Shambhala Books, a Buddhist publishing center, ran his first course on Tibetan Buddhism there. So a lot of people got started in that countercultural thing that Dr. Garrett was talking about. And it, I would say, I would generalize it differently than he did. It wasn't a problem. I think it was an adventure in interiority. That everything in the 50s was to pull people into conformity and out of their interior structures of formation into the control of that consciousness by the state, and teaching people to be in charge of their own interiority, and how to structure that interiority, how to discipline it, how to explore it, were the better courses in the experimental college. That was geared around the experience of meditation, and meditation is still controversial with the left. All right, what happened in 67 when I came in? There was a group of mostly white people, and I'll just mention their names because we're recording this, and their names should be mentioned. Tomasita, a guy named Bill Bayless, Ellen Bayless, William Talcott, Carol Talcott, Ian Grand, Steve Dunn, Patty Crawford, Laurie Zimmer, and me were on the steering committee then. And we formed something which was kind of radical called the Telos community. And that was based on basic communist grounds, which was that we took 3 salaries that came from the student body allocations, and also from a grant from the Carnegie Foundation, which we got. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. We put together a basic bank, and everybody who was on the steering committee gave us what they needed to get by. And so we had some who had children, so they got larger allowances, and we supported ourselves with those 3 salaries that came from the grant for 2 years. And it was a radical experience in sharing, and almost no greed was expressed in that. People really learned to sacrifice, but also to trust one another. So it was a high level of trust. So Ian knew that there was a strike coming. He had been at George Washington University in St. Louis, had been busted there on a bank demonstration trying to help integrate the staff of a bank, and had been given 3 years probation, and had come out to San Francisco, and he couldn't be arrested again. And if he was arrested, he would be doing 3 years in prison, federal prison. And so he had me as cannon fodder. And I was busted. I was arrested. I did go to jail on several occasions behind the strike, and later on behind Los Siete in the mission community. So when the strike started, the white students got together in Gallery Lounge, basically, and all of the different white student groups got together and elected a white strike leader. That first white strike leader was me. And I was invited over to the BSU hut, and there Benny and Terry Collins and Jack Alexis, and I don't know if Dr. Garrett was there. I don't think so. And Nesbitt Crutchfield basically had been summoned, and I used that word on purpose, by Dean Garrity, the vice dean of so-called student affairs and academic dean, and to present their demands. And so they gave me a list of the demands, and for the first time out, sent me over to meet with Garrett to make those demands. I think the most radical demand that was being made was open admission, which meant that anybody that wanted to go to San Francisco State could go to San Francisco State. And if they flunked out the first year, that was their problem. But basically, anybody that applied could come in. That was, I think, the most radical. When I came in, Garrity had my FBI file. on his desk, and amazingly, my CIA file with pictures of me in various demonstrations. So to answer Grace's question, I don't have any pictures of me from those days, but if you do the Freedom of Information Act, you can get lots of them from the CIA and the FBI. So he said, you know, we're not going to listen to the Black students. He was really upfront. This is not going to happen. You can go back and tell him that this is going nowhere. This was not a surprise to the Black students, of course. And Garrity, I don't know how much we're supposed to clean up our language here, but he was a real hole. Let's just leave it at that. He was just a bad person. He'd been a warden in the prison system before he came to San Francisco State. His mentality was a prison mentality. That's what he thought college was for, was to discipline and properly organize the consciousness of the students there. It was to make Black people safe. It was to make everybody safe and tools. So that group of students that Dr. Garrett talked about that went to the state college system would be good tools of the ruling class. I went back and reported, and at that point, meetings were held in various places, and demonstrations began. Under the experimental college, and this was one of the political things that I insisted upon, was draft help. And draft help helped a lot of people, regardless of ethnicity, to deal with their draft, either to get 4F'd or to leave the country. And so we lived in those huts, basically, with eventually as many as 5,000 cops on campus, running around with batons, beating the hell out of people. And the people that were in the programs, African-American students, Black students, and other students would run into the huts, and for some reason the cops never came into those huts, so we were safe there. It would be the role of Roger Alvarado in the strike. Roger was an El Salvadoreño. He was a leader for the Latinx population on campus, and a lot of the other ethnicities also were attracted to him, and he was calling what he was doing the Third World Liberation Front. So that must have been a proto group for what later became what Dr. Garrett is describing as the Third World Liberation Front. But I remember it with the Asian American Alliance, yes, and the other groups that all saw themselves relating to that, and that group strongly supported the Black students and saw themselves in solidarity with it. And Roger made a lot of press conferences where he released statements about brown and non-Black, but people of color approaches to this activity. And I think that what was important, and I think the saddest thing for me about this whole business is we came really, really close. I mean, Dr. Garrett's right. Some of the white students were formed into a really conscious relationship to oppression and to BIPOC people. And the state really came down hard, and it got lost. That unity got lost. And it's almost like we're having to recreate all of that work over again. And I weep because of that. Identity politics is penultimate, ultimately. We've got to move towards an image of unity because that's the state's the capitalist state wants to divide and conquer. And it wants to do that with every group there is.